But Kelvin was in the next room, and Emily's eyes flicked toward the wall, and Sandra didn't push. She told herself it was just teenage stuff. She told herself Emily was adjusting. She told herself she would keep watching. She didn't know that by the time she finally saw clearly, the wound would already be very deep. There is a question that people often ask when they hear stories like this. Why didn't she just tell someone? And I want to pause here and speak to that question directly, because it matters. Emily didn't tell because she was 14 years old and living in a home with a man who had methodically dismantled her sense of what was safe and what was real. She didn't tell because she had spent her whole life watching her mother fight to keep them afloat, and the thought of being the reason that everything fell apart again was more than she could bear. She didn't tell because abuse does not announce itself as something you can simply report and have taken care of. It whispers, it convinces, it makes the victim responsible for the secret. Emily was not weak. Emily was not a child who failed to speak up. Emily was a child who was trapped. And if you are watching this and you know a child who has gone quiet, who has pulled away, who seems to be carrying something they can't put into words, please pay attention. Because sometimes, silence is the loudest cry for help there is.
Emily had been living in this private hell for almost a year and a half when something changed. It began with something small, something she almost dismissed as nothing. She overheard an argument. She was in her bedroom with the door cracked, working on an art project, when she heard Kelvin's voice from the hallway outside her parents' room, low, controlled, cold, in a way she recognized. And then she heard something she had never expected to hear, her mother crying. Not the quiet kind of crying Sandra sometimes did when she thought no one could hear. This was different. This was the kind of crying that comes from shock, from fear, from something landing on you that you weren't prepared for.
Emily pressed herself against the wall and listened. She couldn't hear all the words, but she caught fragments. Her mother's voice saying, "Don't talk to me like that," and Kelvin's voice, steady and quiet and utterly without warmth, saying things Emily couldn't fully make out, but whose tone she understood completely. It was the same tone he used with her, the same calculated calm, the same quiet certainty that he was in control and the person he was speaking to was not. Emily felt the room tilt slightly. She had spent a year and a half believing, on some level, in the deepest and most desperate part of herself, that her silence was protecting her mother, that whatever Kelvin was doing to her, Sandra was safe, that keeping the secret meant at least one of them was okay. In the space of 60 seconds, that belief collapsed entirely.
In the weeks that followed, Emily watched her mother with new, terrible attention. She saw things she had not allowed herself to see before, or perhaps things that had only recently become visible. She saw Kelvin interrupt Sandra in the middle of sentences and correct her in front of other people. She saw him check Sandra's phone with a casualness that made it seem normal. She saw Sandra change what she was going to say when Kelvin walked into a room. She saw her mother apologize for things that didn't require an apology. She saw the way Kelvin could make Sandra doubt her own memory with a single raised eyebrow and a quietly delivered, "That's not what happened, sweetheart." She had a specific name for what she was seeing now because she had learned the word in a health class at school: coercive control. And once she had the name for it, she could see it everywhere.
There is a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing that the person you have been protecting cannot fully protect themselves either. Emily experienced that grief in the quiet of her bedroom late at night, staring at the ceiling. She had sacrificed her own safety in the name of her mother's happiness. But her mother wasn't happy. Her mother was being controlled by the same man in different ways, and Sandra didn't even fully know it yet. The realization did not make Emily angry, not right away. First, it made her desperately, overwhelmingly sad. And then, very slowly, underneath the sadness, something else began to form. A decision, a determination. The quiet, fierce certainty of a girl who has been silent for too long and is finally ready to be heard.
It happened on a Sunday morning in March, almost 19 months after that first night in February. Kelvin had left to run errands. Emily found her mother sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the backyard. The house was quiet.
The sunlight was pale and watery, the way it gets in early spring before the warmth has fully arrived. Emily stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, watching her mother. She noticed things, the tightness around her mother's eyes, the way Sandra's hands were wrapped too tightly around the mug, the way she wasn't really looking at the yard at all. She was somewhere far away, inside her own thoughts. And Emily thought, if not now, when? If not her, who?
She crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her mother. She put her hands flat on the table, and she said, "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me all the way through before you say anything." Sandra looked up. She saw something in her daughter's face, a kind of terrible stillness that made her set down the coffee mug. "Okay," she said. "I'm listening." And Emily told her. She started at the beginning. She talked for a long time. Her voice didn't shake the way she expected it to. It came out steady and clear, the way voices sometimes get when a person has been holding something in for so long that the release of it has its own kind of calm. She told her mother everything, the first night, the months that followed, the threats wrapped in kindness, the way she had stayed silent because she was afraid of what the truth would cost. When she finished, she looked at her mother and waited.
What happened to Sandra in those moments is something that I think only a mother could fully understand. The grief that moved across her face was not simple. It was not just devastation, though it was that. It was not just rage, though it was also that. It was something more complicated. It was the crushing, unbearable weight of realizing that your child suffered while you were in the next room, that she carried something unimaginable and could not come to you, that you were not, in the end, the safe place she needed you to be. Sandra did not collapse. She did not scream. She sat very still for a long moment with her eyes closed, and Emily watched her mother hold herself together with everything she had. Then, Sandra opened her eyes, and she reached across the table, and she took her daughter's hands in both of her own, and she said, quietly, fiercely, with a certainty that would not waver from that moment forward, "I believe you. I am so sorry, and I am going to fix this." And she meant every word.
Within the hour, Sandra had called the police. She didn't hesitate. She didn't weigh the consequences for the house or the finances or the marriage certificate that was still hanging in a frame in the hallway. She made the call, and she sat next to Emily the entire time, holding her hand, while Emily answered every question that the dispatcher asked. 2 officers arrived at the house on Maple Creek Drive that afternoon. They were professional, careful, kind, in the way that good officers are with children who have experienced trauma. Emily was brought to a child advocacy center the following morning, where a trained forensic interviewer, a woman who had conducted hundreds of these interviews, sat with her in a quiet room with soft lighting and let Emily set the pace. Emily spoke clearly. She gave dates when she could remember them. She described specific details. The interviewer later told the detective on the case that Emily's account was one of the most coherent and detailed she had ever documented.
Kelvin came home that evening to a house with police cruisers parked outside it. A detective met him at the door. He was calm at first, the same performative calm that Emily recognized, the kind that comes from practice. He denied everything. He said Emily was troubled, that she had always been difficult, that she had been acting strangely for months. He said Sandra had been putting ideas in the girl's head. He said it was a misunderstanding. The detective listened to all of it without expression, and then informed Kelvin Harris that he was being placed under arrest. In the moment that the handcuffs went on, Kelvin's calm cracked, just slightly, and what came through underneath it was something cold and ugly that confirmed, in a way that needed no further explanation, exactly what kind of man he was. He was charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor. The hospital where he worked was notified. An investigation was opened.
It would later reveal that Kelvin had a history, a prior complaint, unsubstantiated, from a previous relationship that had never resulted in charges. The system had missed it. Many people in the aftermath had to sit with the weight of that. The trial was not quick, and it was not painless. It required Emily to give testimony. It required her to sit in a courtroom and describe what had been done to her, while the man who did it sat 20 feet away. She did it. She sat up straight, and she spoke clearly, and she did not look away.
Prosecutors presented physical evidence, Emily's detailed testimony, and the documented pattern of coercive behavior that Sandra described from her own experience in that house. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Kelvin Harris was sentenced to 12 years in a state correctional facility. He would be required to register as a sex offender upon release. As the sentence was read, Emily sat in the gallery next to her mother. She didn't cry. She just breathed, slowly, deeply, the way a person breathes when they have finally put something down that they have been carrying for far too long.
Recovery is not a single moment. It is not the verdict or the sentencing or even the first night sleeping in a house that no longer has his footsteps in it. Recovery is slow and non-linear and deeply personal. Emily knew this. She had learned it in the counseling sessions that started 2 weeks after the arrest and continued twice a week for the next 2 years. Her therapist, a woman Emily described as the first adult besides my mom who I actually believed was safe, helped her understand that what had happened to her was not her fault, not the abuse and not the silence. That a child in an unsafe environment will always seek the survival strategy that feels most possible in that moment. That staying quiet had not been weakness, that it had been, in its own way, a form of survival. Sandra found her own counseling. She had to work through layers of guilt that no amount of logic could fully dissolve. The guilt of not knowing, of not seeing, of trusting the wrong person. Her therapist told her something that she wrote on a piece of paper and kept on the refrigerator for a long time. You cannot protect someone from something you were deliberately deceived about. That is not failure. That is what deception does. Sandra read it every morning. Some mornings it helped. Some mornings the grief was bigger than the words. But she kept showing up, for herself and for Emily. That was the thing about Sandra Carter. She was not a woman who stopped showing up. They moved to a different town 8 months after the trial. A fresh start, a phrase that sounds simple and is enormously complicated in practice. Emily enrolled in a new high school where nobody knew her story. She joined the art program. She made a friend named Camille, a quietly funny girl who liked the same obscure documentaries Emily liked and who never pushed for more than Emily was ready to give. Slowly, carefully, Emily allowed herself to trust again. Not all at once, not without fear, but in small, deliberate increments, the way you test ice before you step onto it fully. She started sleeping through the night again. She started laughing again. Real laughter, the spontaneous kind that surprises you. She started drawing differently. Her sketchbooks, which had been full of faraway and unreachable places during those dark years on Maple Creek Drive, began to fill with things that were closer to home. Breakfast tables, morning light through windows, her mother's hands holding a coffee mug. Small, ordinary moments of safety, made beautiful by the simple fact that they were real. In her senior year of high school, Emily submitted an essay to a national writing competition. The essay was about silence, about the weight of it, about what it costs, and about what it feels like when you finally set it down. She didn't use her real name. She didn't need to. The essay won second place, and the judge's comment said, "This piece reads like lived truth. There is a voice here that will be heard long after the competition is over." Emily's teacher printed the comments and taped them to the classroom wall. Emily looked at them every day for the rest of the semester. She was 17 years old, and she was learning, slowly, imperfectly, and with great determination, how to be heard. Emily's story reminds us of something that is uncomfortable to sit with, but necessary to understand. Monsters do not always look like monsters. They look like men who bring flowers on the third date. They look like men who fix leaky faucets and teach teenagers how to change tires. They look like men who sit in the third row at church and wave to the neighbors. They hide behind normalcy, behind charm, behind the image of a family that the rest of the world can see and approve of. And they rely, above everything else, on silence. They rely on the shame of their victims, on the fear of families being broken, on the vulnerability of people who cannot afford to lose what little stability they have.
This is why stories like Emily's must be told. Not for sensation, not for shock, but because awareness is the beginning of protection. Because a child who knows that abuse is not their fault and that someone will believe them is a child who is more likely to speak.
And the community that understands what grooming looks like, what coercive control looks like, what the silence of a child who has been threatened looks like, that community is more likely to catch what the system misses. So if you are watching this, and there is a child in your life who has grown suddenly quiet, suddenly withdrawn, suddenly small in ways they weren't before, pay attention. Ask again, even if they say they're fine. Create the kind of safety that makes telling feel possible. And if you yourself are in a situation that feels like the one Emily lived through, know this: you are not alone. You are not to blame. And there is a way out, even when you cannot see it yet. Emily found it. Many others have. And the people who need to hear that the most are the ones who are still in the middle of the silence, still unsure if anyone will listen. We are listening. We see you.
Before you go, I want to ask you something honestly. How did this story make you feel? What went through your mind when Emily sat at the kitchen table, 14 years old, finishing her homework, completely alone? If this were your daughter, your sister, someone you love, what would you want them to know? Tell me in the comments, because conversations like this are how we change things. If this story touched you, please like it and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with a parent, a teacher, a counselor, a friend. Awareness saves lives, and every share this video gets means another person who might recognize the signs in time. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss our upcoming story. We cover real cases, real people, real conversation that matters. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and remember, if you see something, say something. A single voice at the right moment can change everything.